All right. I think going live now. So, welcome everybody to an integrations episode of Growing Down podcast. We have no guests today. We are our own guests, and it's about time I think that we decided to have an episode like this where we've had a lot of interviews recently, and I think it's been percolating just the different perspectives and attitudes. And then Matt was mentioning before we got started, wanting to do a kind of where we've come from so far this year and starting growing down and going through the elections and everything else. So here we are, guys.
Yeah.
Where do we begin?
Well, I think we could start with just the current political news of the president being in the hospital with COVID. And I'm not sure if you guys have been following that today, just sort of how he's doing. There seems to be a lot of information out there that contradictory or really no one really knows. I've heard anything from symptoms are worsening to stable. So, but that's definitely always a twist as far as, going from what happened on the debate to just a couple of days later, everyone testing positive. Yeah, just another shit show happening right before our eyes. Yeah, and I don't really have any. I don't think we have, but any of us have a real clear direction on sort of what this show is going to be like, other than like how you summarized it, Jeremy. We're kind of just looking at all the shows we've done. I think when we started this podcast, we were interested in what integral politics, how do you define it, what does it look like, and really, I guess it's going back, I don't know when we started, in February or something, and we've done 6 months of just having a huge amount of guests on to give their opinion on what their version of the next politics should look like. And I don't know about you guys, if you have any sort of memories that stand out that sort of have changed your guys' opinions, or that sort of still resonate with you when you think about some of the guests that we've had on. I know when I started off, I was really confused on the economic side of it. So it's been nice. I feel a little bit better with an understanding of, MMT, capitalism, socialism, and pretty much, my opinion after this is that we have, if you want something, I think we are, like the government providing it, I think we are in a position where the science and MMT could back, like you could do healthcare for all. You could get these services out there if there was a political movement to have them happen. So really, for me, it's really just about getting to a place where, how do you get enough of the people in America to get to a place, to stand up, advocate for themselves, for getting services that could provide the foundation for flourishing in this country. How about you guys?
I'm trying to remember. So we started the podcast. Was that like right after COVID first hit? So we kind of, I was trying to remember if it was like before, but I think like the first episode we were talking about COVID, right? So it's like we started this whole thing right during this whole unprecedented meta crisis hitting the world, and that's quite the way to start it off. Um, it almost feels. I mean, it's like I was talking to my friend the other day that like it seems like I remember every single day in March and April, and then after summer came, I kind of got used to the all the drama, and it's been kind of a blur since then. But it almost feels like a different lifetime thinking about how much has happened since we started this, and I remember that was when Bernie Sanders was still in the running, and um, there was still a lot of excitement there for the progressive movement, and we wanted to explicitly give the progressive side of things an integral twist and insert our voices into the conversation, because we felt like people like Jeff Salzman or other mainstream integralists still had too much of a centrist leaning or bias, and so we wanted to be kind of countering that with a more progressive narrative. um and yeah, I mean, we've gone so many different directions on this show. I don't really know. It'd be interesting to check back in, see like, did we deviate from our initial vision? Did we expand our understanding of what the show could be like? and you know, you're saying, Matt, you've gotten more clarity on the economic side of things, and what are other how has our own minds changed on issues, right, since starting this and witnessing all the craziness that's unfolded since March.
Yeah, hit it up, Jeremy.
Yeah. So it's funny. I don't think we've strayed very far from our initial intentions, which in my mind were to simply be publishing a progressive oriented media platform in the Integral community, where we found there to be quite a lot of either intellectual dark web oriented or radical centrist oriented orientations. And, obviously that those perspectives are, what they are, but just the lack of progressive voices, lack of economic progressivism or leftism, historical material analysis of the kind of the issues and scenarios that are taking place right now, and how that might dovetail into the evolution of consciousness. Really kind of grounding integral theory in material analysis, I think, for me, was like the goal, the plan. And then also circulating integralists who were like on board with, let's say, Green New Deal, or socializing certain elements of U.S. government, right, in terms of healthcare, in terms of other issues. So I don't know. I think at the time, towards the beginning of this pandemic, what was more on the table for everyone was a discussion about these values and what, can America have universal basic income? What happens when a democratic socialist is the democratic front runner of a presidential candidacy for a while, right? So I think there was this moment, like a temporary moment in culture, where these progressive values erupted and were being seriously reckoned with by the mainstream. And I think we, in that fervor and excitement and energy, were like, let's throw down and like, let's create a podcast and start talking about it and engage in the integral community about these ideas, now that there is so much momentum. And obviously that momentum, I think, receded a little bit as the pandemic hit. And we had serious moments of doubt and austerity practices, and the biggest wealth transfer in global history. So there's been these other macro historical issues that have been going on, and it's been really good to get not only integralists, but like economists and progressives and modern monetary theory as sort of in the mix, right, with our kind of analysis here. I don't know if we have a clearer sense than we did in the past, but it's been really great, I think, to just sort of get everyone's perspectives on this and just put the platform out there that these kind of conversations can take place in the integral world.
Yeah, I mean, just something that came up for me when you were kind of going over that is, yeah, I mean, when we started this, Bernie was sort of the front runner, and we were kind of riding that optimism. But I think with politics, which is why it's so hard for me to for me to stick my nose in there continually, is Bernie got run over by the machine. And the reality of politics is that there's, when you're looking at all the different structures in there, you forget sometimes about not necessarily what the right thing is to do, but sometimes when that machine sort of can take over and you just saw all the candidates drop out. Biden was now the front runner, and it just happened overnight. And that's just sort of the possibility is still there, but it's always about how do you get the reality of the situation to meet what's possible, and how do you get minds to change to go there. And that, obviously Biden was not our candidate that we endorsed, but here we are, in November, less than a month away, I think, from the elections. And what was your guys' take on those debates the other night?
That it was the worst thing in the entire history of the. I mean, I'll say something. I'll say something myself. I mean, in terms of how my own perspective has shifted a little bit since we've began. When COVID first hit, I was seeing the full spectrum of responses politically from elected officials. Right, everyone associated with the progressive movement. Right, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Bernie, obviously, other figures like Tulsi, Yang, Marianne Williamson, they're all advocating for the same stuff that I was totally for in policy wise, right? $2,000 a month until COVID passes, universal health care, blah, 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 blah. I'm still completely for those policies, and I was super fired up and I was very angry that those weren't being passed. And instead we had all of the, corporatism and shock doctrine capitalism happening instead. Of course, not a surprise, but I was still very pissed off about that. And I think back then I felt much more as a kind of firebrand progressive advocate, because it was just like you saw the rampant unemployment, you saw like the depression-esque food, lines of like the food pantry, and just really horrible. I think since the progressive movement kind of petered out after Bernie dropped out, and it's just been since the whole wave of cultural chaos that's ensued around race and everything since the summer, then we had this horrible debate. The majority of Americans are pissed off at mainstream media and just the frustration with the whole, not even in a partisan sense, but just the whole dysfunction of the political discourse, right? Our civic sensibilities of just how to navigate all of this in a way that's not completely divisive, atomizing, and polarizing and tribalizing. And that frustration is at an all-time high. So I've been very depressed about that. So my kind of attitude towards this all has shifted more towards more of a mediator kind of a role in that. I mean, I'm still, in terms of the policies and candidates I support, that hasn't changed at all. But my depression is not so much dominated by what policies are not being passed, but by just the overall cultural discourse. So I've been thinking more as a mediator, as a cultural mediator, as a mimetic mediator, than as an advocate for certain policies or positions. So that's kind of been how my mindset has changed with the times. And I'm hoping that if there's any silver lining with the debate, that the majority of sane people can see how badly dysfunctional that was, and we can try to ride that wave into a more meta-narrative of depolarization or unity or something. I don't know if that'll happen, but I'm hoping that I can try to steer it or jujitsu the conversation right in that kind of direction.
Do you feel that this year we've seen from the beginning, I think a kind of an excitement about progressive values, but now there seems to be, especially during the pandemic, an intensification of disagreements, reality tunnels, fragmentation, right? Like it doesn't, to me anyway, it seems as if our ability to talk across mimetic polarities or centers of gravity is even more difficult than it was at the start of the year when we got started, right? So I'm wondering what your sense is about that, Ryan and Matt too.
I'll just say really quickly, I've been watching some Daniel Schmachtenberger videos, and he was saying that like we can't even agree on what the problem is. Like people think COVID is a scam, right? People think that systemic racism is not a thing. No one can agree on anything that's true anymore. So it's not only that we have different ideas of the solution, we can't even agree on what the problem is. And that's like such a, I mean, what can you do as a democracy when you can't even agree on fundamental issues? But climate change it's a hoax or whatever, right? So it's like, I feel like it's that aspect of it has been vastly intensified. And I think in some ways it's a good idea to really put front and center the epistemic crisis that's hit from COVID, along with everything else in the meta crisis. But this epistemic crisis of like what's true, what's real, what's a good source of information, that needs to be figured out, and kind of has fueled my interest in talking to conspiracy theorists and try to get a better sense of what's going on with them. So yeah, it always makes it more difficult to mediate, because if the issue is solely about values or identities or needs or interests, there's a more wiggle room in creating a solution. But if it's an epistemic issue where you can't agree on what's true and what's not true, it's very hard to try to mediate on that level, right? Because that's usually what courts and judges and science is for, not so much. So that's been interesting for me to try to figure out how to do that, and I've usually been approaching it as what are better ways that as a society and as a political community we can build trust around these issues, and how can we trust institutions again and trust each other and trust credible sources. So the answers have been interesting and wide ranging. I got to do more work for this, but I feel like that's kind of like the next step is, I don't know, epistemic mediation or something.
Well, that's where I think, again, the integral model, I think, answers that. If it's brought up enough and if people can agree the model works, specifically like developmentalism, developmental politics. I mean, you watch that debate and it was pretty clear to me from the get-go that Trump was trying to stick Biden with the far left label, Antifa lover, whatever you want to call it. And I mean, for the one time I was like, well, there's no way that label can stick with Biden because he's anything but those labels. And that's sort of what really could ignite the right, is to say, hey, you're for chaos and disorder and rioting and, all these things. And you look at Harris and Biden, you go, well, no, that's not exactly what they are. I mean, so if you look for some sort of, at this stage, as far as the silver lining and things, there was definitely that moment where he was like Teflon, and usually, that's his label for Trump, but there was no way those labels were sticking with Biden. And for me, Ryan, that's why I like the integral model so much, and the developmental side of it is that it pretty much lays out why the right are advocating for these things and why the progressives are advocating for systematic racism. And so the problem with me and has been for many years since I've been into integral is that you really don't see it in the national media spotlight. It's always this left-right spectrum, and there's no, even when we've talked to Daniel Gortz and talking about how meta-modern politics supersedes both that left-right spectrum and puts it sort of above and in the center. And to me, that's really where, if we're looking at all this chaos that's happening, people not, sort of agreeing with each other, that's where, to me, the attractor is, to talk about how you can start differentiating some of these things, like the left sort of putting down rioting and advocating for peaceful protests. And to me, the model fits, the map's there. And to me, the surprise is, why aren't people in the sense making community using this map to explain the crisis? To me, the answers, it appears, at least the framework is there to provide the map as far as where we go. But still, even in these communities, you still, for me, you don't see integral, sort of with an asterisk, maybe a far spiritual, maybe doesn't really fit into how we make sense of kind of what's going on right now. But at least for me, it still is the model that I use to provide, okay, well, it makes sense why he's coming from this position developmentally. Not sure if you have any thoughts on that.
Ryan, you want to jump in first? I have different views on developmentalism, or less to say really about developmental.
Well, that's why I want to hear what you have to say, Jeremy. I mean,
and it's even for us too. I mean, for us to be in this position where, two integralists on an integral podcast still have, and I know even from a Gebser kind of point of view, as far as, and I did finally read Ever Present Origin, so I could hopefully comment with some authority on my take on that. As far as how these sequential stages unfold. So yeah, go ahead and take it, guys.
Yeah. Ryan, you want to go first, and then I'll jump in with something adjacent?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of times when I'm talking about mediation to people, the first thing they always ask me is, how do you change people's minds? And of course, my answer is like, well, that's not really my goal, right? My goal is to understand people better. But to your point, Matt, I do think that we can have two axes or two, I guess you could call them lines for which people can change their mind, right? So one is horizontally in terms of changing the content of their mind. I used to believe X, now I believe Y. That's what most people associate when they think about people changing their mind. The second part of it is more of a vertical complexity level, which was I still believe the same thing content-wise, but I believe it at a level that's more nuanced, more abstract, more sophisticated, more complex, more intricate, right? And so this is what Hanzi's distinction of like code and stage. So they believe the same code or content, but it's just articulated at a higher level, basically. And that's one thing I've been enjoying exploring on how to provide the pathway to understand the same content of what you believe in and express it at a higher level, right? So that's where I feel like a developmental model can be helpful, and especially if I don't want to like brag or anything, but if I was who's, you know, if I'm ostensibly integral or whatever, and can have a more complex take on an issue, I can read what conservatives are reading, I can read what progressives are reading, I can take the information and try to synthesize it at a higher level and regurgitate it to them in a way where it's still hitting their core values, so they're not going to reject it, but hopefully in conversing with me or others, right, they can have a more sophisticated grasp of the concept, so it doesn't manifest as antagonistically or as in such a polarizing and unnuanced way. Yeah, other than that, I do find there's also, you know, there's so many systemic causes that also drive the crisis. I mean, you know, the Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix, right? Like algorithmically, and the influence of, you know, the for-profit competitive media market system that is designed to hijack the worst parts of our brain in order to get more views so that these companies can outcompete each other, make money, and algorithms are designed to keep us insulated and cocooned into our own little world. There are a lot of structural factors that also feed into that too, that I think need to be also considered, like lower right quadrant factors and upper right quadrant factors that need to be considered in tandem with a more, you know, upper left quadrant or developmental approach too. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been thinking about.
Yeah, I think there's some definite utility in a developmental mimetic approach, but like you're saying in the latter part of your comment, I think there's so much that needs to be understood with the environmental media ecologies in which we're communicating with one another, and of course that is where the markets come in, and this is where the Social Dilemma comes in as a documentary. I haven't actually watched it yet. I've read so much reviews and commentary on all different articles and all over the web, but generally speaking, I think this is the ground, the kind of common ground. And I guess I see it a little differently in that, you know, a higher perspective that we can agree on, to me, is more of like a coming down to earth in a place that we can both step into, as sort of a co-inhabited space, and co-inhabit it differently. But we're that's sort of what we're looking for even in our podcast, which is what is the common ground, or what are the points of commonality that we can meet, let's say the alt-right or IDW, etc. And it is not a kind of like both sides kind of approach. I don't think that's really the what we're trying to do. It's more of how can we construct an effective left that addresses the issues that are arising, let's say in the alt-right or in a kind of violent populism or a xenophobic populism, that would be better addressed with something more constructive and regenerative. And how do we actually scale that in terms of class consciousness, or in terms of you know, taking collective action to transform our markets and our media environments so they're not as polarizing and not as incentivizing for hyper polarizing statements and you won't believe what this person said, and that kind of outrage Twitter echo chamber. I don't know how else we call it. I think like really finding a way to mediate through that is so deeply important. So any utility at like mimetic mediation, developmental politics, organizing class consciousness, helping the left and the right to understand the significance of labor, right, in terms of the working class, and then the academic and Twitter lefty community, like getting back into reality together, I think is really important. And I don't know how we do that. An article I've been working on for, it's either going to be Perspective or Emerge, is this sense of like needing to get the internet offline, right? Which is kind of a paradoxical statement, but the utility and possibilities of networked virtual culture are fantastic, but we're learning that you can very easily and readily kind of encapsulate yourself into your own reality, your own mimetic reality, organize facts differently. And so the question is, how do we actually inhabit a shared world again? Like differentiation and virtual avatars and the creation of our own kind of subcultures and niches have been fantastically successful, but too much so, to the point where we're not actually able to organize and leverage power, let alone, you know, not just the left, but also the right, et cetera. Although I think the right is better at it. So how do we get offline? But how do we take the tools and the network style thinking with us? And I think that's the real challenge and the real question that I've kind of come around to this year, is that the subtle Cartesianism of digital activism and internet culture, especially in the context of the pandemic, where we're all thrust into the virtual space and debating each other and having these culture wars online, have been really highlighted. So how do we get offline, right? How do we actually come down to earth with one another rather than reify this sort of Cartesian holographic simulation of the world, right? Where we could be hashtag activists, but then what are we actually doing in material space to actually transform our lives in a material sense? And I think that, for me, that's the big question from this year. I don't know how that fits into things developmentally, but this is sort of how I'm framing kind of what's happening right now.
I need to jump in with this quote from Matt McManus's book on postmodern conservatism, because Jeremy, it's exactly what you're talking about. So I'm going to read it. The identity adopted by the postmodern conservative is not one of virtuous authenticity grounded in concrete attachments to real communities and their values. It is instead a pastiche of different tropes and identities, often though not always assembled through consumption of hyperreal media, which are assembled despite their contradictions and tensions to help stabilize the postmodern conservative's sense of self in an unstable postmodern culture. So in practice, postmodern conservatives are in no sense realists about the self and human nature. They construct their identity out of the materials made available by postmodern culture. The normative and epistemic judgments of postmodern conservatives flow from the perceived need to maintain this pastiche-like identity, meaning that they are not realists about the external world either. So what McManus is articulating so eloquently is how modernity as a whole, I think it's safe to say, has completely deracinated us from the local. And the difference between the postmodern conservative and the traditionalist conservative is that the traditional conservative's sense of identity is very much rooted in their local place and environment, right? I grew up in this small town, my parents did, and so did my grandparents and multiple generations going way back. And I live in this very tightly knit Gemeinschaft, kind of pre-modern or pre-industrial style of communal lifestyle. Everyone knows their role and everyone knows each other in this town of 150 people. The postmodern conservative is completely enveloped, right? Completely in this world of the simulacra, of the internet, of 4chan, of Reddit, and they're assembling their sense of identity in a kind of a paradoxical way. They're assembling a sense of identity through pastiche-like mixing and matching of historic memes, whiteness, Western civilization, malehood, etc., to try to provide a grounded sense of essentialized identity through postmodern anti-essentialist tools and cultures and ideas, right? So it's very paradoxical and very ironic, but the core of it is a kind of longing for the roots, a longing for belonging, a longing for some essentialized identity that I can cling onto in such a rapidly changing, chaotic world. And they're doing it in a way that further dissociates them from the local, the rooted, the down earth, right? And so they're trying to find that sense of identity through larger historical motifs of, Western civilization or European identity, right? But there's more of a dissociation from the local. So I think obviously COVID has exacerbated that even more, because we can't go out and go to church or go to local gatherings. Everything is on Zoom or online. So we're even more sucked into this hyper reality. So yeah, that's kind of something that I've been thinking a lot about lately.
But I mean, even in that example of using postmodern and traditional conservatism, you're using a developmental framework, right?
Well, McManus is not. He's talking about it more in terms of like memetics or style.
Right, but I mean, at least from that perspective, I mean, at least using the integral model, saying one conservative is coming from a traditional point of view and one's coming from a postmodern point of view, hopefully people can take a big picture perspective and understand that's sort of how the ladder goes, right? I mean, and I guess for me, I don't know why it has to be stuck in sort of a utility mimetic approach. If anything, it should provide some perspective to sort of all these, I did want to quote here and see if it applies. This is from Trump in a Post-Truth World by Ken Wilber. When all truth is a cultural fiction, and there's simply no truth at all, epistemic and ontic nihilism. And when there's no binding moral norms anywhere, there's only normative nihilism. Nihilism upon nihilism, there's no depth anywhere, only surface. And again, he's talking about that. This is coming from the postmodern green evolutionary edge. And finally, there's no binding guidelines for individual behavior. The individual has only his or her own self-promoting wants and desires to answer to, in short, narcissism. And that is why the most influential postmodern elites ended up embracing explicitly or implicitly that tag team from postmodern hell, nihilism and narcissism. In short, I know you don't like this term, Jeremy, aperspectable madness, which just cross that one off. And then it defines it as the culture of post-truth. And it feels like that's all we're doing. We're like in this bumper car room of culture of post-truth. And I think even for this podcast to succeed, I think we have to kind of, my understanding of Integral from Gebser's EPO was that you're able to see the whole. And that doesn't mean the fragmentation that happens at that mental ratio level. It doesn't mean because you're at Integral, you somehow then transcend that, and that's not part of your operating software. You still have that ability, but also the ability to stand back and go, okay, well, this is why a conservative is coming from a traditional perspective or a postmodern perspective. I'm not sure if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, we're looking at a trajectory of a structure of consciousness that Gebser talked about, and really, like in that comment from Wilber, you could just scratch out the A out of perspectival and call it perspectival madness, and I think that would be a much more accurate statement of what's actually going on the ground. But generally speaking, there is something that I think I again, like I don't know in terms of traditional conservative versus postmodern conservative. I think the postmodern conservative is really just, been intoxicated by perspectival ratio in the same way that perhaps the left and postmodern academics, et cetera, have successfully achieved, and also, deficiently achieved in terms of like hair splitting and the kind of archetypally negative postmodern like Derrida or something. Like I find Derrida interesting, but this kind of like where like everything can be deconstructed. Where is the world? Everything is about semantics and syntax and linguistics rather than a shared material co-inhabitation, right? So like that kind of de-worlding, right? That kind of deconstruction of world into abstract analysis, the postmodern attitude is a perspectival expression, right? And I think it's just finally like a capstone of the perspectival world. It's suffused everybody, including the quote unquote conservatives, who are still, everyone is in the perspectival world. It's just that we're kind of now, I think, at a more extreme end of its trajectory or life cycle. And we're trying to figure out how to navigate out of that, because now we're at a point where I think the internet has successfully substantiated, ironically, the perspectival world's de-worlding trajectory. It's out of this world rocket that Bruno Latour talks about. So we've been de-worlded, we don't have a shared ground, and we can construct and enact any kind of reality we want, including on the conservative side or the progressive side, et cetera, right? So I think that's like the major problem here. And again, I don't necessarily need to see that as developmental, but I certainly can see it as a development of the perspectival world, and perhaps not a good one, or perhaps one that can open other possibilities, right? Like knowing that there's an end to this and there's really nowhere else to go from here using this mentality. How do we make that turn, right? Like the Growing Down podcast is down to earth. So, how do we make the turn down to earth from here if if conservatives have retrieved postmodernism for their own aims, as anybody can, right? In terms of that deconstructive, deworlding, telos of the mental rational. And that's the kind of question I'm thinking as well. Like, how do we move into the regenerative, the aperspectival? How do we have a sense of shared reality that is still constructive, right? Like you're saying about not being completely against perspectivity, right? We still participate in the creation of worlds and worlding, but now we have a shared sense of ground that we're co-inhabiting with. I think that's the real kind of material question. And again, I think part of that is the internet has been this Janus face tool that has created networks, and then it's also revved up the Cartesian perspectivity into this Wilberian aperspectival madness, right? So what do we do with that? And I think that's the question. What do we do with this?
Oh, go ahead, Matt. Yeah, this is what I really want to talk to Matt Segal about, who's going to come on next week, and he's an expert in like German Romanticism and stuff. So I really want to ask him about this essentialist pull, right? The compulsion towards some kind of essentialist identity, like Alexander Dugin when he went on Stoa. I think of Dugin as a civilizational essentialist, basically, right? And so I think the thing I kind of disagree with Wilbur about, with his take in Trump in the post-truth world, and disagree with kind of like right critiques of the kind of neo-fascist, nationalist, populist movement, is that they place too much of the blame on postmodernism and Mean Green meme and driving that. I do think it's partly true. There's no doubt to me that that's partly true, that the reactionary turn is partly inspired by people's annoyance with the damn SJW. That's partly true, but they're missing a larger theme, Jeremy, which I think related to your Stoa talk, which was the larger techno-economic structural features of modernity, capitalism, and just the urbanization, industrialization, the disenchanting power and the alienating power of modernity has kind of reached an apex, right? And the postmodern philosophy and culture may exacerbate, the tendencies of late stage capitalism, but ultimately it's modernity that drives us. And my argument to prove that is that Japan doesn't really have Mean Green meme. There's no talk about like race and identity in Japan. Most of the green activists in Japan are environmentalists. But Japan's going through a very scary kind of nationalistic turn that some people are going like, whoa, this is getting a little bit too close to like some World War II kind of make Japan great again kind of a thing. I have some family members in Japan who my dad is very worried about because they're really becoming nationalist in a very unhealthy way, right? So, and it's driven by anti-globalism. Right, it's driven by anti-orange, not necessarily anti-green, and people are looking for answers to alienation, disenchantment, moral disenchantment, lack of, Ben Shapiro, his book, he calls it like how reason and moral purpose made the West great. And the idea of having a moral purpose, right, a morally infused purpose, it has a very Petersonian connotation to it. It's not just an arbitrary, individual, hedonistic longing for material acquisition, right? There's a deeper moral calling to something. And unfortunately, if that impulse is not channeled in the right direction, in the way towards the integral, towards the aperspectival, it will just become a kind of romantic, regressive, reactionary backlash. And Wilbur talked about it too in terms of the ego camp versus the eco camp, and the romantic kind of pre-trans fallacy that occurs, searching for longing and essence and unity that becomes fascism, right? So how do we? I really want to talk to Matt Segal about like how do we really feed that yearning towards the integral, right? Not go towards the pre-modern, fascistic, pathological collectivism, which I think someone like Dugin is advocating for.
I guess my challenge is why, my understanding, Jeremy, you could speak to this of the wearing, sort of to me, I mean, I'm not sure why, again, I think for us, this is maybe the challenge to both of you guys and to us on this podcast is how can we present a solution? And if we're saying integral is a solution or a path to a solution without without, again, we're using these terms like orange and green, and then, but we're also coming at it from a sort of a flatland perspective. We're not saying there's really any developmental difference in these things. They're flat. They're all even, and it's just a matter about picking sides. It's all horizontal. And for me, I'm not sure why, as from an integral approach and also from a Gebser sort of perspective on how, you know, that how do we group all these things together? So if it is down to earth, that to me, that doesn't mean we return to sort of agrarian practices. It's about being where we are today technologically, and also bringing up consciousness. So for Growing Down, this podcast, for me, it's a politics of consciousness. And I think it's important when we're talking about these things of either, you know, these things, you know, and sort of why I shared that Wilbur quote is because I think it identifies exactly where this leading edge is of postmodernism, of narcissism and nihilism. The problem is that if you're at the green perspective, and these folks that are from Japan wanting to return to something like nationalism, because the green leading edge isn't presenting anything above that. It's a return to sort of like, it is a return to your roots, because you're connecting back with a lower level, a structure you already know, a structure that's comfortable. And developmentally, when you're challenged with something, if there's not some sort of safe harbor to go forward to, you're going to go back to return, or else you're just going to be stuck in the storm. So I guess, you know, for me, it's like this podcast can't succeed unless we're able to take it from a developmental perspective. One of the reasons I like Zach Stein's approach, especially with education, there's no way a teacher is going to treat a kindergartner, a fifth grader, and a high schooler the same, because there's developmental change that is happening. It's sequential. There's tons of evidence-based reasoning into these things. And I'd be careful, you know, if we're advocating for this leading edge of not having some sort of understanding of that developmental approach.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I disagree, but you know, I think the emphasis shouldn't be on. I don't know if we can really have the even abstract superiority to say that we are somehow at a higher stage than postmodern conservatives. I think. You know, obviously, to not argue for developmentalism, to actually argue against it, isn't to say that there are different aspects of depth, dimensionality, interrelationships of the structures of consciousness. There's all sorts of weird topologies and remixes and retrievals that happen, I think, in cultural evolution. I guess I have a more of a biological definition of what cultural evolution is, which is, or yeah, a biological definition of that is that evolution is a transformation. It's just the remixing of what the capacities of an organism, its morphology, its abilities, maybe adding complexity in one way and then removing complexity in another way. Now, I think the holism aspect is interesting, and that, to me, at least as a potential, like I hold out developmentalism for the point in which we can wear the whole of human history and all of our different forms of expression, all of our different structures of consciousness. If we can become transparent to that, dynamically flexible and consciously so, that's the day that progress actually occurs, right? That is the moment where we have somehow leapt into some greater intensity of integration and holism and transparency. And I don't think we've done that. I think as a whole, we've moved from different dimensions and different aspects of consciousness and consciousness unfolding. Of course, there's been some sequence, but that's why I think that the model of individual childhood development and then macro historical development really kind of gets messy. And everything that we're looking at in terms of anthropology today points out that this fluidity and capacity of enacting different worldviews doesn't look like development, but looks more like putting on a certain thing and going back to another thing. It'd be almost as if you're a toddler stage of development, but then you switch back to an infant, and then you switch up to a 7 or 8 year old, and then you switch back depending on what's needed, meaning or implying that there's some kind of dynamic creative matrix of intelligence that's actually kind of putting things forward as needed and folding them back in to the complexity of the social organism. And we see this in history. We see this in anthropology. So I think rather than, like, for me, the most important thing, and you could interpret this as development if you wanted, but the most important thing is cultivating this capacity of fluidity, complexity, different perspective taking, and then also different social enactment, right? Like, having that fluidity again, I think, is the most important thing. And the only way to do that is to cultivate the sense of, transparency in the history of consciousness. And I think this is our difficulty today, which is we're so stuck, right? We're so stuck in an overreached, overemphasized form of consciousness, and we lack that fluidity. So if regaining fluidity is a higher stage of adult development, like, a Taoistic sense of like retrieving the childlike pliability, but with the consciousness of the adult, surely I could probably like at least agree with that aspect of developmentalism. But I think that capacity, however we call it, is really what's needed, right? Like fluidity, perspective taking, and being able to creatively remake ourselves and our society, right? And this is something the left is talking about. And this is also like, what we need is a capacity to even reimagine the world. Like you're saying, like, we don't want to just go back to an agrarian society, and we can't. So what's really needed is a kind of novelty, right? How do we remake the world or remake ourselves in relationship with the world? And, obviously this is a capacity that we aren't currently enacting, because we're stuck on this autopilot or this one directional, approach to economy, industry, capitalism, etc. No matter how much we're talking about it, we're still enacting this civilizational suicide, right? Or even species level self-destruction. So having that fluidity and pliability again of world making, I think, is really vital. And maybe consciously reintegrating that at this level of social complexity is novel, but I see that as the kind of great challenge of our time. Anyway.
Ryan in his comfortable mediating position, just totally being in the sidelines. You son of a gun, you. Well, when we're talking about deliberately developmental culture, and some of our guests like Bjorkman bringing that up, I think it's maybe worth then advocating what that might mean. To me, it's I'm not sure how. Again, this is, I guess, a good discussion. We've definitely gone a few rounds on this. Earlier, Jeremy, I have you kind of wrote down that everyone is in the perspectival world. I guess one of my questions is, that also includes some indigenous folks that maybe haven't, sort of got to sort of that modern perspectival kind of world. My other sort of thinking on this is to bring up holons. And I think it's important to recognize when we're talking about developmental levels, and that each level is a holon in itself. And to say that one is greater than the other, I know there's been, some of those remarks made, and I think we can get stuck in this sort of arrogant sort of approach. And a few of our guests that we've had on it has taken sort of a different perspective on that. But I think when we're trying to narrate what the hell is happening in the world, and I hope what we're doing is bringing, hopefully, a different perspective that maybe isn't being included in that media ecology. And my argument is because they're not seeing it from a developmental perspective. And you could, Brent had a wonderful comment here, our boy, Mr. Smart Hulk, about, where to go, Brent? Advocating, where are you at? Basically saying that we are above, yes, we are at a higher stage than postmodern conservatives. Why? What are we advocating for that's above postmodern? Is it, and why is meta modern just equal with modern and, postmodern? Or is it advocating this is, no, there's a new mutation here, a new perspective that came from this matrix that's interweaving all with these different sort of stages. And hopefully, hopefully we have the solution. We're bringing it forth. You know, we're saying integral takes in the whole, but it also doesn't sort of wipe out and negate all these different fragmentations that have happened that I'm advocating for, and developmentally, that each of us go through these stages. And rather than continue to have left, right, beat the shit out of each other on the streets, how about we just see it as a stage, right? And that there's both healthy expressions of it, and there's both unhealthy expressions of it. And how then can we make sense? And it's important for us, I think, to bring this solution forward because it's not being offered out there in the media. Now I got to bring in my boy Ryan, who's sitting on the sidelines. Here we go, Ryan. What you got?
So I mean, Matt, I actually understand a lot of what you're saying. So here's kind of like I really hesitate talking about this. It just seems so weird, and I don't really feel comfortable articulating it. But basically, I've been, as some of you know, as some people know, I've been like infiltrating a bunch of like different groups, and I did one yesterday that I'm not going to speak about the specifics of it, but it went extremely well. And basically, how do I say this? The crude way of saying this is I'm doing spiral wizardry and helping them to evolve. That's so cringy, so I'm not going to double down on saying it like that. But I do think that the developmental approach can be very helpful. And I do see it all the time talking to a huge spectrum of people. Development is definitely a real thing. It's much easier to work with it on like a one-to-one level, right? Like mediation or coaching, or working with like a group of like 4 to 5 people. As Jeremy was saying, it's just hard to map that onto lower left quadrant and make such a large generalization of people being at the same level of complexity or structure. They may share the same mimetic content, but they're at all like, if you have let's look at Antifa and with I don't know how many thousands of people who associate with Antifa, and then if every one of those guys gets assessed by Pacific Integral's developmental team and with Terry O'Fallon, right? You have thousands of different levels, right? Like there's so much developmental diversity within each mimetic tribe that you can't really make a generalization of like, oh, these people are blue, let's get them to orange. These people are orange, let's get them to green, right? You have to work with it one-on-one and try to just find out in the group organically, where are some tensions that are emerging that want to be spoken about? What are some potential gray areas, shadow spots, blind spots, areas that could use more nuance or complexity that is kind of naturally coming up, but no one wants to look at that elephant in the room. And then if someone's sensitive and trained to be able to see that, you can kind of surface that in a way that is not threatening and have people explore that. And that's what I was able to do yesterday. And it, not to brag, but it succeeded beyond my wildest imagination. So I do think that there is a lot of value to developmental approach, but I don't believe in this kind of Procrustean having this model and then very, very, superimposing in a very rigid way on mass groups of people, right? And even with within the integral community, everyone identifies as an integralist and all studies the content of integral theory. But no doubt, we're all at different developmental levels ourselves that are appropriating and translating the concept of integral in a whole bunch of different ways, some of which we would completely disagree with, right? Like the proprietarian guys were saying they're integral. So yeah, it takes a lot of nuance to really work with development consciously. How to map it onto large cultural trends, to me, I think has to be done with a lot of, we have to be really mindful about how we do that, as to Jeremy's point.
Yeah. Matt, you want to jump in?
Well, sort of how Ryan just sort of advocated for that. It was able to be done from a individual perspective and, help in their evolution. And I think while it may be more difficult, and I commented in the room here that I know Hansi's take on code complexity, I forgot the other two, I think deepens a little bit of the spiral dynamics that is very common in the integral community. But to me, it has to be done at a collective level. So I know, so the problem is if we don't start bringing up these ideas, you're going to have the integral Proud Boys. And as far as these dilemmas that go, and I think that's really where we're at. It's the reason why there's nihilism and narcissism is because there's really no other, where do you go from here? And I know even coming from my own individual perspective, why integral was so attractive is because it gave you another sort of perspective to see why is there all this war going on. So I think if you can do it individually, you have to be able to do it collectively. And one of my biggest complaints of today's culture is that the academia, whoever you want to say is in charge of sense making, isn't giving you an alternative that, in my opinion, and I think the meta-modern community obviously is bringing something very similar to the table. And I think you have to, when we're speaking of a planetary culture, we have to be able to look at these things and either reject it ourselves or embrace it and advocate for it.
So let me just ask you a question, Matt, and I'll follow up, and then I want to hear what Jeremy has to say. So are you saying, Matt, that like as a community or integral culture, as the leading edge of consciousness development, it's kind of incumbent upon us to build an alternative model to what's present as an affirmative vision so that people have something to land on so they don't regress back to like nationalism?
Yes.
Okay, so I have an entire strategy of how to do that. You want me to just tell you?
Sure.
Do it.
So here's my grand plan to save the world. I mapped the whole thing out last night. So there are two areas I've talked about in the Discord channel that I'm really focused on working on. The first one, per spiral dynamics theory, is the integral version of racial justice and social justice. And I have a whole kind of way that I've studied this and framed it, and I've actually been presenting it to social justice groups and to Buddhist groups that are interested in social justice that already have a meditation or spiritual framework. I'm also presenting it to the Marianne Williamson group that I'm a part of. So I'm finding groups that are at the leading edge that I think are kind of like green, borderline integral. And of course, right now, right, race and identity is the hot topic. And can we use that as a portal to integral, right, instead of a downward into like tribalism, which can happen, I think, if it's not done consciously or carefully. So I've been leveraging that and talking about, I've been calling like social justice and kind of like decolonization movements as psychotechnologies of decentering, right? So what's in social justice circles, it's called a white supremacy culture, but all the qualities that they list of white supremacy culture really are like deficient perspectival mental, basically. So I'm using that as an opportunity to decenter the mental fixation, including unhealthy elements of postmodernism or identity politics, to a more kind of meta, diaphanous, transparent, integral, flex flow, complex kind of a way of looking at things. And that's what I did yesterday. I joined a study group on the book Me and White Supremacy, and I was so proud of myself. It went so well, and that's every Friday. So I'm working that angle. And it's amazing how people there really appreciated it. And these are mediators who are knee deep in social justice circles. And they said that they found what I was saying, my integral meta modern take on social justice, which I have to thank Brent for too, because Brent and I have talked privately about this, holding race as a paradox, and he's really helped me flesh out my thinking around it. So I quote Brent Cooper a lot when I talk to these people, and they really appreciate, they're like, that's so creative and insightful. And I never heard anyone say that before in these communities. So that's definitely getting traction. The next integral piece that I'm working on is another program that I'm going to be launching in about a month, hopefully. And it's basically an integral depolarization community class training workshop. And it's all about a holistic, all-quadrant approach to depolarization and understanding all the factors that lead to depolarization: personal, neurological, social, technological, economic, political, and developing a kind of holistic, full system mindfulness or awareness of how we become polarized, and then being able to scale that. So I'm going to test it out on the Buddhist group that I'm a part of, from my temple in Hawaii. We'll see how that goes. And then I'm going to, after I prototype that, some friends are helping me develop that. I'm going to send it to the head of my mediation center and blast it out through the government of Gresham and try to host that through the public sector, and then get other mediation institutions that we're connected to start offering similar programs and trainings, and then networking it that way, and then getting it into the private sector, into corporations. And my vision with this is depolarization is the opportunity to Trojan horse as much integral and meta-modern thinking as possible, and then create workshops and trainings that are scalable. And so I want depolarization to become kind of like the next social justice movement. Right now, there's so many trainings on racial sensitivity, all this kind of stuff. So I'm like, okay, let's take that and give a more integral version, and then let's give the full-on integral depolarization. And I have it all mapped out. So yeah, this is my strategy to save the world. And then my last idea is, okay, if I am able to run for office and capture an actual political office, I would want to set up actual local community integral anti-debates that will actually be a contest that debate participants come together and debate a subject that's important for the community, maybe a heated politically charged issue. The criteria to judge who wins is basically going to be who is displaying the most integral traits. Okay. The next, so the winner, so we're trying to create a community and culture on a political level that consciously encourages or valorizes an expression of integrality. Are you able to take multiple perspectives? Are you able to steelman your opponent's perspective? Are you able to communicate in a non-polarizing way? Are you able to integrate diverse interests into a unifying vision, et cetera, et cetera? The next step after that is I become president of the United States and we create a fourth branch of government that has all of the people who are in these debates. All of the winners from all of these communities get to go into the fourth branch that will then be the populist branch filled with the most integrally minded people from all over America to challenge the judicial, legislative, and executive branches as they currently stand. So it's basically a way of achieving Ken Wilber's vision of saying his kind of utopian idea that if you're at Teal, you get more votes than someone who's at a lower level, right? Of course, that's never going to happen and totally crazy. But there is kind of a way of how do we put people who are the most integrally minded into formal positions of power, especially if you don't want to run for office yourself. And to me, this is kind of a way of doing that. So does that kind of get to your answer your question, Matt?
Yes.
Okay, and I don't know where to jump in from here, Matt and Ryan, but that's quite a bold plan, Ryan. You have my vote, and you have my support all the way to the White House. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting things here. My only issue is really just like, again, especially today when we're talking about, and I don't see this necessarily in your strategy, Ryan. I think it's a good strategy, but in terms of emphasizing developmentalism, like obviously I think a lot of our answers and solutions, or the kind of a perspectival turn, looks a lot more like indigenous thinking, and it looks a lot like a kind of post-humanist turn, right, that we've been talking about a little bit. So with these dimensions, with these reorientations toward the non-human world, to the spirit world, to lines of flight and fugitivity that Bayo Akomolafe discusses and that Gebser talks about in terms of decentering ourselves from the perspectival world, there's a lot of reintegration and remediation, but like in biological evolution, there's a lot of, interesting creative retrievals. And I've been watching a lot of and reading about a lot of interesting adaptations in morphology as almost these kind of aperspectival retrievals in different life forms. So like thinking about the spiral and the nautilus shell, somebody was commenting on that in the YouTube stream. A lot of cephalopods actually took their shells and then basically sucked them into their bodies as sort of an internal or bone in a way, and then repurpose that for a kind of flotation device and organism. So like in squid and octopi, you have like, they're able to have buoyancy now with this old technique, this old like outer husk, which has been completely repurposed. And evolution's morphology is always doing this, is taking a particular organ that may have been very important at one time, miniaturizing it, and then restructuring it and reusing it for a whole other thing, right? So I'm thinking about this in terms of the structures of consciousness, like how do we like restructure the mental and miniaturize it and reorganize it into this larger whole? So I think a lot of metaphors and models like this, it's not that they're not necessarily emergent or there's like emergent complexity. It's just that linearity and stages seem to be insufficient language to conceptualize what's actually going on with emergence and complexity. There's a kind of hyperdimensional topology of how an organism's morphology changes itself and reorients itself to the world in its own kind of adaptive sense making, or however we call it, mutual learning with the environment. So how do we do that with the perspectival world? How do we do that with the perspectival world's expressions of colonization, of, all of those kind of catchwords today that are on the left in terms of like, capitalism, capitalist realism, colonization, white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like these are all kind of extensions of this perspective of world and the unique way it's manifested itself. And they're all kind of coming undone and spiraling apart. So how do we kind of take all that, retrieve it, and fold it back into the human whole right now at this planetary scale? And maybe that's developmental. I think it's also just, the way evolution, creative evolution has always worked. And a lot of it is, again, like decentering our models, decentering our modernistic models of hyper abstraction and spatializing and, tiering and systematizing things according to the way, the mental mind likes to map. How do we do that? How do we do this integrally? How do we talk about emergence in an integral fashion?
Can
And
I
I'm
ask you
just,
about
this is
that?
sort of adjacent. Yeah.
Sure. So like, I remember that Thomas Bjorkman, I think he mentioned posthumanism a little bit at the end. And so my question, Jeremy, is that like, I think what can be difficult about an ontological shift, right? To decenter the anthropocentric perspective that was so reified in modernity to this post-human otherness towards the weird, towards the quantum, towards the entangled, towards the animal, right? It's not just a neutral metaphysical shift in being and perspective. There's also a deeply held value shift that comes about that. And what my concern is that for a lot of people, right, especially for academics who are part of the kind of classical liberal arts education humanist tradition, there's a hyper valorization of the human, right? The cultivation of the human and high culture and the the Renaissance man and it's very much a part of like the Western tradition, the Western canon. Shakespeare, the literature of Shakespeare, he told us how to become human, in modernity, right? And so the post-humanism, the post-human shift, I can see being, as it grows, will be met with a lot of resistance and people doubling down on the humanist tradition in a very reactionary way. So is the idea, in your opinion, like how do we hold that tension? Do we hold the human in a more integral way along with the birth of the post-human, or do we have to completely leave behind conventional notions of humanism to move to a fully post-human world of strange entanglement? Like how do we manage that, do you think?
Yeah, I think part of it is accepting that the human is being composted. I don't think this is so much of a choice. Like this is where we're headed, right? So it's like, how do we creatively participate with this process that the Earth itself, right, the planetary itself is undergoing? It's composting the anthropocentric world, and there's really nothing we can actually do about that in terms of like resisting it or triumphing humanism in some aspect of it. But I think in that process there might be a kind of um again, miniaturization of the human, right? Like those things don't go away, but like maybe they get folded in now into this larger whole. So I think that's a very interesting question, and it doesn't need to be either or. I don't think there's a binary here. Like the human, the way the human relates to the non-human world is always going to be in some capacity human, right? Like just like a shark will interact with the world through its sharkness, right? It's shark sense making. And I think the human and its human sense making and its integral ontology of archaic, magic, mythic, mental, etc., is going to continue and perpetuate in a new relationship. So I don't think it goes away. That's not going to make this any easier, though, right? I think with the age of the climate crisis and systemic manifold collapse, there's going to be a profound reckoning, and we kind of have to learn to die to ourselves. And all of this discussion and talk is fine, but I think in the context of the kind of planetary dynamic changes that are going to be occurring, like there may not even be United States at the other end of this century. Just like geologically speaking, if climate has anything to say, the restructuring of our coastal cities, right, the environmental changes that are unpredictable and complex systems, like we're being reshaped, from the bottom up, top down, in out. So that process, I think, is happening. The post-human is happening. It's just like, how do we relate to it? I think, how do we respond to it adaptively, creatively? And I think we do this through the archaic integral, in the sense of the archaic structure of consciousness is sort of this latency of all its different dynamisms of being human, that we see in the Upper Paleolithic and that we see in early human societies, a kind of a latent pliability and malleability of all of these different capacities of social systems and social organization. So to me, again, like, you know, in order to respond, in some ways we have to like really respond with our full human post-humanness, in the sense of like as integral beings, highly adaptive, highly creative. That's the only real way through this, I think, because it's not going to allow any sort of rigidity, right? So I'm kind of getting us into like the regenerative culture questions, Anthropocene, climate crisis, and how like integrality really needs to come forward through that.
Yeah, I think, you know, talking a little bit about what you're saying here, I think with, if I remember from EPO, that integral is sort of when you become conscious of the archaic, right? And so I think it's important to bring in Michael Brooks's version of the cosmopolitan socialism, and how I think Jeremy has expressed he was wanting to get integral more online with his community. And I just want to read something here, sort of toward the tail end of the Trump and the post-truth world. And this was written after the election, after Trump won the election. Conversely, feeling nothing but despair at Trump's victory is to fail to see the larger currents at work in this situation. Understanding this election, as well as similar events now occurring all over the world, as a manifestation of a self-correcting drive of evolution itself, as it routes around a broken leading edge green and attempts to restore the capacity of its leading edge to actually lead, while also seriously starting to give birth to the next higher leading edge of integral itself. This gives us a glimmer of real hope in an otherwise desperately gloomy situation. In the deepest parts of our own being, each of us is directly one with this evolutionary current, this eros, the spirit in action, radiant to infinity and luminous to eternity, radically full in its overflowing superabundance and excessive in its good graces, wildly crashing off the heavens and irreverently erupting from the underworlds, unconditionally embracing each and all of its limitless love and care. And I just brought that up because we're in a situation where we'll be a month of reflecting back on what happened in this election. Will it be Trump? Will it be Biden? I think there's a lot on the line. And the last kind of point I'd like to make is that they are not equal on developmental stages. And for all the beef that I give Biden, he is at a higher level of stage than Trump. And I will go to war with anyone that wants to argue otherwise. Trump is regressive, narcissistic. He's taken advantage of this postmodern melees that we're in. And if we can't get our heads out of our asses pretty soon in the next month to make sure that it's established as far as there is a direction to where we're going. And again, you could take that integrally and sort of deconstruct that. And I don't mean a straight linear direction, but only in the sense that is evolution working in all of us to something that's more whole, more transparent to the spiritual. And I think it's important as we discuss what does the politics of the future looks like, what does integral politics, look like. I think it's important to bring perspective, hopefully educate as many people as we can as far as there being some sort of something there. And if it's still debatable, let's have that debate, let's have that discussion, because I think it's necessary, because it's not being talked about in the media.
Sorry, I missed most of that. I was in the bathroom. So Jeremy, if you want to.
Oh, okay, no worries.
It was brilliant, Ryan.
I'm sure it was. I'll watch the replay.
Now, you mentioned cosmopolitan socialism, and I think, like, again, this is Trump is an interesting expression of something that I think is universally, I mean, beyond the Trump supporters, perhaps, who don't see it this way, but I certainly agree with you that he's expressing a kind of regressive flight from transformation, and ultimately an uncreative and self-atomizing retreat from like a challenge, a planetary challenge, a way to be fully human. He's retreating from his full humanity, and there's a spiritual illness in this. It's more of a kind of psycho-spiritual fragmentation and retreat. And of course, that is deeply tragic and deeply dangerous for somebody who wields that much power. So, we can interpret this developmentally, of course, and say that, Trump is at a lower stage. I don't know if that's necessary or not, but he's certainly sick. He's certainly not fully human. It's certainly an unhealthy and unwise response to these planetary challenges that favor, a kind of xenophobia and nepotism over actual transformation. So I think, those critiques are certainly worthy of being thrown at him and so forth. But at the same time, I think even in indigenous perspectives, they would probably see him as suffering deeply from Wetiko or something along those lines, rather than the indigenous perspectives being somehow lower than Trump, because they're not, right? I mean, this is its own cultural ecology, its own kind of form of sense making with its own orientation. So I think we should be, again, careful about developmentalism, while acknowledging that I think no matter what kind of cultural ecology or structure of consciousness that we're looking at, everyone has a sense of what's wrong with that kind of partial self-destructive attitude. Like there's something that is against life in that, right? And with our own culture too, right? With the industrial capitalism that we live under and within, that there is a kind of flight from life and from embodiment, which is ultimately self-destructive. I don't know if that's higher or lower, but it certainly is, against life. So the answer, that I hear, like Shreko Horvath and a lot of, European international leftists talking about, is a sort of internationalism or extinction, which I think Michael Brooks was also kind of on board with, in terms of the only way to really build ourselves up is somehow through the synthesis or combination of the hyperlocal and the universal or the planetary, or as like Michelle Bowens talks about, the cosmolocal, right, with Jose Ramos. And I think these principles are deeply important. Again, whether or not we see these as, because they seem to be doing different things, they're going into a more macro perspective, and they're also retrieving the depths and immediacy of the hyperlocal, right? We seem to need to bring the two together in a way that isn't abstract, right? It's not necessarily higher, but it is wearing through. It's spherical, it's whole oriented. And maybe that's just really another way to talking about fifth dimensionality, which is a higher dimension technically, et cetera. But that is what I think is needed. The ability to be simultaneously hyper local and also global throws out globalization. It throws out the processes of modernity that have been colonizing and extracting the vitality of the life world, right? So how do we do this together? And I think this is the question we're orbiting around, successfully or not. But that to me is like our central question with Growing Down, is like, how do we articulate this emergent mentality of the hyperlocal and the planetary, the hyperlocal and the cosmopolitan socialist, right? Or socialism, which, for the conservatives out there who are afraid of that word socialism that we've talked about with Jason Snyder, there's I think room for going out on your own and doing your own thing connected to the whole, right? So there's that in mind as well. But it seems to be the direction we need to articulate, and it's at the tip of our tongues. We're all having different expressions of this. And I think we're having various forms of opaqueness and transparency with this new expression. Like if you look at Dugin, I think he has a very opaque form of this, which is very ethnocentric. It's very much a flight from a shared world, right? But he's also emphasizing the regional, the roots, the local, et cetera, which I think is important, right? So I think we have to have that level of discernment, which does require, some critique and not sort of flat landing everybody into an equal plane, right? So certainly, but maybe we could just say degrees of opacity and transparency are needed, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, something that I just wrote in the room was the Stein's planetary integral paideia was, I think, something that best encompasses sort of what we're talking about. And what we're trying to do, and very similar to what Ryan was sort of talking about, is create this sort of foundation of where we can continue to nurture all of these different complexities that are going on, but it's for the purpose of growth and flourishment. So I definitely think we're getting close to this. And I think goes back to Ryan's sort of original point on the Daniel's podcast or podcast he was on, of where no one really can sort of agree on what the problem is. Is that what it was, Ryan? And I think hopefully what we're doing is circling the wagons around what the problem is, and hopefully presenting a way out of that. And I think, as Wilbur even talked about, like 4 years in that book, is like to bring this developmental model onto the stage and have it be discussed, have people discuss it. I think is definitely needed in these times.
There's another wrinkle to throw in here in our remaining time. Something I've been thinking a lot about is, from a horizontal perspective, what is the proper relationship of the different value spheres of society to each other? And this is something I feel like I would love to see more literature or more attention on. And I first heard of a lot of social theorists. From Rudolf Steiner has a whole social theory about it called social threefolding. Daniel Bell has his own version of it, but generally speaking, it's that society is comprised of different like key sectors, right? There's like the political sector, the economic sector, and the cultural sector. There's something called liberating theory, and talks about like a kinship sector on top of it, like a civil society sector. And then like if you read like Bruno Latour and his modes of existence, right, there are like 11 different value spheres of society that all crisscross and interpenetrate, but they all have their own distinct mode of truth or value, science, religion, and so forth, that has its own sense of value in the system, right, in the network. So one of the theories that really stuck with me from Rudolf Steiner is that these different dimensions need to be in the right relationship with each other. The wrong relationship that is when one sphere colonizes or takes over the other ones, right? So he says that like totalitarianism or like Soviet communism is when the government takes over everything. You ban religion and there's no private sector, right? America, we have capitalism takes over everything, right? We have a marriage of corporation and state, and then the corporate sector colonizing the cultural sphere is like what's it called, the culture industry, right? That like the critical theorists criticize, right? I think what we're seeing now, especially with how Trump has campaigned, is that the cultural sphere that's been propagated or disseminated through social media technology has flooded everything. And so what Trump is doing now in the 2020 campaign is to go full on culture warrior. A lot of political commentators have said that Trump was never really viewed as a political figure, right? He's not really like about hard policy or about how we traditionally conceive of a politician like Obama or Clinton or someone, right? He's really a cultural phenomena, and he's really amplified the culture wars in a very polarizing and divisive way for political gain. And so I view Trump as someone, if Trump does win based off all of his culture war rhetoric that he's spewing at Biden, Antifa, and the radical left and so forth, right? The critical race theory thing where he like banned it, right? That's a purely symbolic culture war move. And if he wins, to me, it's kind of an instantiation of a new age where like culture is now the predominant issue. And I think in an ideal world, with collective intelligence and policy design, we don't have to worry about all the cultural symbolism and identity and BS that goes into politics, right? It could just be about like, what's the best policy to help the most amount of people that's best for the whole? And all of the symbolism and all of the identity and all of the emotional charge around it can be, which maybe it's a criticism of democracy that we're always going to be susceptible to populism and demagoguery in unhealthy ways. But it's just that the culture flooding into everything is really, I think, a kind of a novel phenomena that I worry about. And I think with social media, it's so easy to start mixing those two realms together when you have the average person just giving their comments and then getting likes and retweets and so forth, right? It's a lot different from the one-way street of broadcast media. So I don't know. I think that if we want to have a developmental perspective vertically, we can also talk about this horizontal relationship. In a truly integral society, what should be the proper relationship or harmonization of these value spheres so that society works coherently and we don't have one trying to colonize or take over the other one?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of this, though, and you guys can pick this apart a little bit and study it, but the question of the value sphere of the social ability or culture war being so emphasized right now over policy, over, well, let's just stick with policy as one example. Part of this, I think, is also we can trace this in a kind of material history sense to the loss of the commons, right? The kind of atomization of culture, the lack of third spaces and unions, and a sort of social imaginary that had enough cohesion to hold things together and enable kind of a translation between the culture wars and actual like substantive policies that are getting enacted as a result of everyone's kind of shared social values and ability to kind of translate those values into institutional policies, right? And these are our values, this is our society, this is how we want to enact our society and live together. That sense of living together, our culture has been, and there's analysis from this on the left saying, well, it's capitalism, it's sort of its own kind of logic to ultimately deculture us and social imaginary us, ultimately to kind of create our own little isolated atoms or islands that are basically kind of having their own sort of micro culture and not really participating in a kind of collective sense. So there's a sort of erasure of this mediary commons that I think is a very well, it's obviously one of the most important issues that we're dealing with. But I think the question is like, can we just go back and like revive labor, revive the social imaginary of a somewhat socialistic modernity, or is there some other way in which we need to actually retrieve some of those values and principles, such as labor and third spaces and guilds and associations, and do it in a way that like actually is more appropriate for a cosmopolitan context or a planetary context in the climate crisis with digital technology, right? So my point about this is maybe the internet and the overemphasis on the culture wars is directly proportional to the lack of a genuine social imaginary and public social space in which we are translating our values into kind of real world traction, right? So it's almost like an unhealthy, toxic, overemphasized version of itself because it has no ground, right? So it's a lot of heat but no light, that Amber Frost talks about in her essay on the poison chalice of hashtag activism, right? A lot of heat but no light, in terms of like there's a lot of flurry of tweeting about certain things, but like, does anything actually get translated into policy, right? Is there a legitimate pathway to policy that you're talking about? So that's my question. If that makes sense.
So let me paraphrase to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you saying that, are we theorizing that perhaps this mushrooming or inflation of the culture world, right? The inflation of the culture wars and all of its lots of noise and very little signal that can translate into policy is a kind of a product or a symptom of this deracination from the local and from the roots and from place. Are you kind of saying that?
Yes, I do think so. And that technology has been very good at like at not in itself, but I think it's been part of that process of ratio and inflation and deworlding, et cetera. And so like we're all online and talking about this and having heated Twitter wars, but like meanwhile, like there's been really no substantive transformation of culture or policy or economics, right? So it's been this sort of like funneling of the social imaginary into the abstract. Again, very Cartesian, right? And that's sort of my point in that it's a kind of Cartesian projection into the virtual, rather than somehow using networks and digital culture to integrate into the body politic, into policy, into third spaces, right? Like we seem to lack this effect of turning it down into the world, right? It's still very like out of this world oriented. And perhaps that is also why there's a lot of heat and no light, like we're talking about.
Yeah, just to riff on that really quickly, I think I might have talked about this on the show before, but something that was quite illuminating from Ezra Klein's book on polarization was how, with the absence of local consciousness comes an inflation of the national, right? We're so subsumed into what is Trump doing, national politics, national policy, as we should be, but the local and state levels are completely, like, does anyone know who their like local council people are, or who like the mayor is, or what they are, or like who your state senators are, right? So this dissociation from local politics creates this inflated subsumption into the abstract idea of a national politic, and that is something that is very highly contributive to polarization, right? It actually creates a vicious feedback loop, because polarization, local politics is boring, so you have to nationalize the local in order to get funding or coverage, right? And so when I was at the farmers market in Gresham, there was a guy running for mayor who was like associated with the Proud Boys, and they all had American flags, and it's like, what does this guy have anything to do with like local mayoral policy in Gresham, Oregon, right? It's all cultural symbolism based on like, I'm pro-Trump, I'm pro Blue Lives Matter, anti-Black Lives Matter, Proud Boy. It's all these abstract, cultural issues we're facing that he's just injected into the local with no emphasis on policy or anything. Like, I looked at the policy page, there are like 3 policies, and they're all about like the police. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I think that's such a problem. So yeah, again, the theme over and over is it's growing down, and that will ground the inflation, right? The inflationary, we can use an economic analogy of like, people talk about like gold, right? Gold like grounds the inflation of the dollar, or of just running the printing press gone crazy, right? So I think there's a lot of analogies we could use to talk about some of the pathologies of the inflation of the mental perspective.
Mm-hmm. We're coming back down to, I'm glad we're like, as we get to the end here, we're coming to like a coherence about this, right? Like, how do we get back to the local? How do we deflate the heat of the culture wars? And what are they a symptom of, right? Like, I think that's also a good way to position it, is like, what are the culture wars a symptom of? Why are they so hyperinflated? Why is there so much heat and not a lot of light? What's missing in our material cohabitation of the United States, of the globe, et cetera, that doesn't have that rootedness, or is missing an appropriate rootedness for our times? Maybe it needs to be reimagined. I think it does, but yeah.
Well, my answer would be that the when you talk about the Proud Boys and that section of culture, they're fighting the left, and the left are fighting the right, and that's why I think it's important to come up with the developmental perspective, the second this leap into conscious meaning, or whatever, I forgot the actual definition of it, but there is an understanding. And I think culture, everything's culture or tetra arising. So culture is an important piece. And obviously there's policies that Trump brings, even though it's usually anti-green, anti-Obama policies, they're pretty clear policies. Just being against whatever they rolled out is probably more power to corporatism, in my perspective. And I guess I want to leave it with this, and especially at how Wilbur leaves it in post-Trump, or Trump in the post-truth world. We can endlessly and we can try endlessly and tirelessly to fix this dream, or we can simply wake up. And I think that's kind of what all of us are waiting for, is just to wake up. And that's all I got to say.
Amen. Seems like a nice place to end.
Yeah. Good conclusion here. And thanks everybody for tuning in. I think we went a little over this time, and it was really fun to just have a kind of philosophical salon discussing all these questions. Hopefully we were not too out of this world for this discussion. But yeah, definitely needed integration episodes, and let's do this again soon. Now, next week we're going to have Matt Segal. He's a CIS professor and a good friend. He's a near future author at Revelor Press, and we're going to be talking with him next Saturday. A kind of a reflection of, well, Brian, you invited him on the context of Dugin, right, on the Stoa, and kind of responding to Dugin's vision of the future with a kind of German romanticist, bioregional, Matt Segal's obvious brilliance. But I don't know if you wanted to comment on that for a moment.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, Matt, Matt's an expert in romanticism and German philosophy and German idealism. So I wanted to see if he thinks it's also kind of a romantic impulse. Is this impulse towards nationalism, white supremacy, fascism, is that a romantic impulse, and really unpacking the historical and philosophical underpinnings of that movement, and see how we can jujitsu that in a healthier direction.
Yes, yeah. Great. And then I think the 17th, we're going to have Ben Burgess on. At long last, Ben Burgess from Give Them an Argument, the Give Them an Argument show. and he was a friend of Michael Brooks. He's a leftist, and we're going to be talking about all sorts of things. We could totally pick his brain about everything, but he's been writing quite a bit about cancel culture. His new book, I think, is Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. And he's also written a very interesting article on cosmopolitan socialism. So we're looking forward to discussing all of these topics with him. And thanks, everybody. See you next time.